Picture this: a rugged, windswept coastline where glaciers loom like ancient sentinels and the air carries the sharp bite of the Arctic. Here, under skies that dance with the northern lights, Norse Vikings not only survived but thrived for centuries. These were the Greenland Vikings, a people who carved out farms, raised livestock, and built sturdy stone churches in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Their settlements dotted the fjords, a testament to human resilience in the face of nature's harshest challenges, but then, something unimaginable happened. By the 15th century, every last Viking had vanished from Greenland, leaving behind empty homes, abandoned tools, and a mystery that has puzzled historians for over 500 years. What could have driven an entire civilization to disappear without a trace? Was it climate change, starvation, conflict, or something even more sinister? The clues are scattered like fragments of a shattered artifact: a single skeleton found curled in a fetal position, records of desperate letters sent to Europe pleading for help, and eerie silence where once there was life. The Greenland Vikings didn't just fade away, they vanished as if swallowed by the very land they had conquered, and the most chilling part, we still don't know exactly why. This is a story of triumph and tragedy, of a people who defied the odds only to meet an enigmatic end. Over the next few minutes, we'll piece together the evidence, explore the leading theories, and venture into the heart of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Were the Vikings victims of their own ambition, or did forces beyond their control seal their fate? The answers might just rewrite what we thought we knew about survival, collapse, and the fragile line between them. So settle in, because the truth is far stranger than anything you could imagine. Erik the Red, exiled from Iceland for murder, didn't just flee, he turned banishment into opportunity. In 985, after exploring Greenland's icy coasts, he returned with a bold pitch: this harsh land could be home. His salesmanship earned Greenland its name, a clever trick to lure settlers with the promise of fertile pastures. And it worked. Hundreds followed him across the treacherous North Atlantic, founding the eastern settlement near modern-day Qaqortoq and the western settlement deeper north by Nuuk. At their peak, these colonies thrived with nearly 5,000 people, a staggering number for the Arctic frontier. They built farmsteads with thick turf walls to insulate against biting winters, raised sheep and cattle in meadows that briefly turned green each summer, and hunted walrus for ivory, a luxury good traded back to Europe. The Greenland Vikings weren't just surviving, they were mastering their environment with ingenious adaptations. They sewed hooded sealskin jackets to block wind, crafted narwhal tusk tools, and even imported timber from Norway to construct stave churches, like the one at Hvalsey, whose ruins still stand today. But their greatest strength trade also tied them to a fragile lifeline. Ships from Bergen brought iron, grain, and communion wine in exchange for walrus tusks and polar bear pelts. This wasn't just commerce, it was their tether to Europe's Christian world, symbolized by the bishop's seat at Gardar, yet Greenland settlements always danced on a knife's edge. A single failed harvest, a mistrade ship, or a shift in the climate could tip them toward disaster. For 4 centuries they walked that tightrope. Then abruptly, the rope snapped. Life inside a Greenland Viking farmstead was a study in resilience, every detail shaped by the battle against cold and isolation. Their homes, low and sturdy, rose from the earth like natural extensions of the landscape. Walls of stacked turf blocks, sometimes 6 feet thick, trapped heat from central hearths, while smoke curled through holes in the roof. Driftwood beams, precious as gold in this treeless land, framed the interiors where families crowded together during the endless winter dark. Archaeologists have found tiny loom weights in these ruins, suggesting women spun wool from their Norse sheep, even as frost crept under the doorframes. Food was a constant calculation of scarcity and ingenuity. In summer, they drove cattle to highland pastures, where the brief explosion of grass could fatten livestock. But winters demanded brutal choices, slaughtering most animals before the cold set in, preserving meat in salt or fermented way. When stores ran low, they turned to the sea. Seals provided blubber for lamps, skins for clothing, and meat that could mean survival. At the western settlement, bones tell a grim story over time. Seal remains outnumber cattle bones, a silent record of desperation as the climate cooled. Yet these weren't just scrabbling survivors. At Hvalsey, the best-preserved Norse ruin in Greenland, a church of sandstone and mortar still stands with walls 15 feet tall. Here, under arches that echoed with Latin chants, the Vikings clung to their European identity. A bride and groom exchanged vows in this very building in 1408, the last recorded event before the silence fell. The church was more than stone, it was a declaration. Even at the edge of the world, they dressed in wool woven with intricate patterns, drank wine from imported wooden cups, and pinned their wealth to a single commodity, ivory. Walrus tusks were the colony's lifeline. Hunting parties ventured perilous distances to the Nordisetter hunting grounds, where men risked their lives to harvest the white gold. A single shipload of tusks could buy iron tools, church bells, even stained glass from continental Europe, but this reliance became a trap. When cheaper African ivory flooded European markets in the 14th century, Greenland's trade collapsed. Suddenly, no one needed their tusks, and without ships arriving, they lost their source of nails to repair houses, weapons to hunt, and the very materials that made survival possible. The cruelest irony, their Scandinavian cousins had begun using windmills and crop rotation, thriving in an era of innovation. Meanwhile, Greenland's Vikings doubled down on tradition. They kept grazing cattle on overgrazed pastures, chiseled rune stones in Old Norse as if Europe hadn't moved on, and ignored the Inuit hunting techniques that might have saved them. Pride, or perhaps rigid cultural identity, blinded them to adaptation. In the end, their greatest strength, unyielding Norse resilience, may have sealed their fate. The last written record, a ship that arrived in the 1420s, found only abandoned farms, their doors creaking in the wind, and a single body clad in a hooded cloak, curled as if asleep in the snow. Even as the Greenland Vikings clung to tradition, the land itself turned against them. Around 1300, a climatic shift began that would rewrite the rules of survival, the Little Ice Age. Temperatures plummeted across the northern hemisphere, glaciers advanced like slow-motion waves, and winter's grip tightened with each passing decade. In Greenland, where life already balanced on a razor's edge, the change was catastrophic. Summers grew shorter, sometimes by weeks, leaving crops stunted in the fields. Pastures that once fed herds of cattle now yielded only scrubgrass, forcing families to slaughter livestock earlier each autumn. The sea, their lifeline, became a prison of ice. Thick pack ice choked fjords for longer periods, blocking the ships that brought trade goods and hope. Archaeologists studying ice cores from Greenland's glaciers found a chilling clue: layers of dust from the 1400s, evidence of endless winters where snow rarely melted. Tree rings from nearby Norse sites tell the same story: narrow, cramped bands signaling years when almost nothing grew. Imagine a farmstead in the eastern settlement, its storage pits half empty, children's bellies swollen from hunger, while outside, the cold seeped through every crack in the turf walls. The Vikings had faced harsh winters before, but this was different. The cold didn't retreat, and then there was the silence from the sea. Ships from Norway, once regular visitors, now arrived sporadically, if at all. With Arctic ice expanding southward, the old trade routes became death traps. A single voyage that once took weeks might now take years, if the ship didn't vanish entirely. Letters from the period reveal the desperation. In 1347, the Bishop of Gardar wrote to his superiors in Norway, begging for a ship to evacuate the colony. No one came. By the 1400s, the last European traders stopped sailing west entirely, lured instead by warmer ports and cheaper ivory from Africa. Yet the cruelest twist wasn't just the cold, it was who survived it. While the Norse starved in their dwindling settlements, the Inuit thrived. These indigenous hunters had mastered the Arctic's rhythms for centuries, building flexible snow houses, sewing waterproof sealskin kayaks, and harpooning walrus from the ice edge. Their diet relied on fatty marine mammals, rich in calories to withstand the cold, precisely what the Norse, with their shrinking herds of malnourished cattle, lacked. The two cultures coexisted for generations, but the Vikings stubbornly resisted adopting Inuit techniques. A single Norse account mentions trading with Skraelings, their dismissive term for the Inuit, but there's no evidence they ever learned to hunt seals from kayaks or build igloos. Pride, or perhaps fear of losing their European identity, left them eating shoe leather while their neighbors feasted on seal blubber. By the time the coldest decades arrived in the 1400s, the choice was stark: adapt or perish. The Western settlement fell first. Excavations there revealed charred roof beams, suggesting frantic attempts to burn whatever remained for warmth. In the Eastern settlement, the last holdouts buried their dead without coffins, wrapping them hastily in shrouds. One skeleton found near a farm's doorway shows signs of rickets, a disease caused by starvation. The final blow may have come from an unexpected direction: sand. Core samples from Greenland's soil reveal layers of wind-blown grit dating to the colony's last years, a symptom of overgrazed, eroding land. The very pastures they'd relied on for 400 years had turned to dust beneath their feet. The last written record of the Greenland Vikings comes from an Icelandic ship that landed in 1422. The crew expected to trade with familiar faces. Instead, they found empty houses, rusted tools, and a single skeletal figure still dressed in a woolen tunic, its fingers clutching a rusted knife. No battle, no mass grave, just silence. The cold had won. The Greenland Vikings built their entire economy on a single, shimmering commodity: walrus ivory. For centuries, their hunting parties risked life and limb to harvest tusks from the Nordisetter hunting grounds, a frozen expanse where men battled crashing ice floes and polar bears for their prize. Each tusk represented wealth, carved into chess pieces, religious relics, or luxury ornaments for Europe's elite. They funded everything from iron tools to stained glass for their churches. But in the 14th century, this lifeline snapped. A new source of ivory flooded European markets: elephant tusks from Africa, transported by Portuguese traders along expanding sea routes. Unlike Greenland's perilous Arctic hunts, African ivory was cheaper, more abundant, and easier to acquire. Almost overnight, the Norse found their white gold worthless. The collapse was catastrophic. Without ivory sales, they couldn't afford to import the goods that made survival possible: barrels of Norwegian grain to supplement failing crops, iron nails to repair ships, even the church bells that once called the faithful to prayer. A single ship's manifest from Bergen in 1392 lists mundane items like wool, cloth, and soap, all now out of reach for Greenland settlers. The price collapse wasn't just an economic blow, it severed their connection to Europe's spiritual and cultural heartbeat. No more priests arrived to ordain new bishops. No more merchants brought news of the wider world. Greenland became a ghost on the edge of Christendom, its people fading from memory even as they clung to life. But the crisis ran deeper than lost trade. The Vikings' entire social hierarchy depended on ivory. Chieftains who once flaunted their status with imported swords and fine fabrics now presided over hollowed-out communities. Excavations at Garthar, the bishop's seat, reveal a startling shift. Where once there were ornate crucifixes and glass beads, later layers yield only crude bone needles and patched clothing. Even their burial customs changed. Gone were the elaborate Christian graves with iron crosses. Instead, bodies were wrapped hastily in shrouds, some with amulets of carved walrus bone, as if pleading with old gods for deliverance. The most heartbreaking evidence lies in the trash heaps. Middens near abandoned farms show Norse families eating their dogs in their final years. then scavenging seabirds from cliff nests, a stark departure from their proud cattle-herding traditions. One bone fragment from the western settlement bears knife marks where someone tried to boil marrow from a horse's leg, an animal they'd never have consumed in better times. Yet even as they starved, they clung to the trappings of their identity. At a farm in Vatnaverfi, archaeologists found a rusted iron key buried beneath a doorstep, as if the last resident still hoped to return. Trade wasn't just commerce for the Greenland Norse, it was oxygen. When the ships stopped coming, they didn't just lose goods, they lost the technology to replace them. Without imported iron, they couldn't forge new tools. Without timber, they couldn't repair boats to hunt seals. Their isolation became a death spiral. By the time a German ship accidentally drifted ashore in 1540, the crew found only ruins and silence. The last Greenland Viking may have died staring at an empty horizon, waiting for a sail that would never appear. While the Norse were slowly starving in their turf-walled farms, another people thrived just beyond their doorstep, the Thule Inuit. These indigenous hunters moved across Greenland's icy expanse with an ease that baffled the Vikings. Their kayaks, sleek frames of driftwood and sealskin, cut silently through fjords where Norse rowboats struggled. Their igloos, built in hours from wind-packed snow, offered warmth without the need for scarce timber. Even their clothing outmatched Viking gear. Double-layered seal fur parkas repelled water and cold far better than wool soaked through by Arctic storms. The Inuit didn't just survive the Little Ice Age, they mastered it, turning the Norse's greatest struggle into their advantage, yet the two cultures collided more than they cooperated. Norse sagas refer to the Inuit as skrælings, a term dripping with disdain, meaning wretches or barbarians. Viking graves contain none of the Inuits' sophisticated harpoon heads or toggle seal hunting gear, suggesting they never adopted these life-saving tools. One chilling account from the Icelandic annals describes a skirmish in 1379 where Norsemen killed Inuit hunters near the western settlement, only to face retaliation days later. The violence hints at a deeper truth. The Vikings saw the Inuit as threats, not teachers. The cost of that pride was staggering. While Norse settlers starved, the Inuit feasted on ringed seals, their fat, rich meat providing 5 times the calories of Norse cattle. Archaeologists find Inuit winter sites, stacked with bones from successful hunts, just miles from Norse farms where children's skeletons show signs of malnutrition. The cruelest irony, the Inuit had once been eager to trade. Excavations at Norse sites reveal a handful of Inuit artifacts, a soapstone pot, a few walrus ivory figurines, tokens of what could have been a lifeline. But the Vikings, clinging to their European identity, seem to have rejected deeper exchange. Perhaps the most telling artifact is a single Norse spear point found lodged in an Inuit tent ring. It's the only Viking weapon ever discovered in a Thule site, not a tool gifted in friendship, but a weapon thrown in fear or anger. By the time the Norse were boiling their last horse bones for broth, the Inuit were carving intricate designs into walrus ivory, their culture flourishing. The land hadn't defeated the Vikings, their refusal to adapt did. The ruins of Hvalsey church stand frozen in time, its mortarless stone walls still defiant against the Arctic wind after 600 years. Inside, on a summer day in 1408, the last recorded event in Greenland's Norse history unfolded: a wedding. The groom's name was Sigrid Bjørnstadtyr, the bride Thorstein Olofsson. Their vows, spoken under a roof that would soon collapse into silence, marked not just a union but the flicker of a dying civilization. By the time their grandchildren might have celebrated anniversaries, every Norse farm in Greenland lay empty. Archaeologists piecing together this vanishing act face a haunting puzzle. Unlike other lost civilizations, there are no mass graves, no burned strongholds, no evidence of a single catastrophic event. Instead, the clues whisper of slow unraveling. At the western settlement, a bone needle lies half-finished near a hearth, as if its maker stepped away mid-stitch. In the eastern settlement, storage pits sit filled with carefully stacked animal bones, not waste, but emergency rations someone intended to retrieve. Even the dead tell a quiet story. Graves show no signs of violence, skeletons wear no armor, just bodies laid to rest with fading Christian rites, then none at all. The most revealing finds come from trash heaps. Normally, middens document daily life. Here, they chronicle desperation. Deep layers hold robust bones from healthy cattle and sheep. Near the top, the brittle remains of seabirds, foxes, even rodents, whatever could be scavenged when traditional food vanished. At one farm, a dog's skull bears knife marks where someone removed the tongue, a final meal from a loyal companion. Yet amid this decline, strange order persists. Excavated homes show no signs of looting, tools hang on walls, loom weights rest where they fell, and in one eerie discovery, a child's wooden toy horse sits upright on a bench, waiting for play that never resumed. Written records from Europe add chilling context. A letter from 1424 describes a ship forced ashore by storms near Greenland's eastern settlement. The crew expected smoke from chimneys, the clamor of a Norse harbor. Instead, they found naught but wild beasts and birds, no bodies, no signs of struggle. Just vacant farms where doors swung open to the wind, their interiors layered with decades of dust. The absence of mass graves suggests no plague or invasion struck. People simply left or faded away one by one. Perhaps the most poignant clue lies in what wasn't found. Norse Greenlanders buried their dead with crosses, combs, even coins for the afterlife. But the final graves contain only the bodies themselves, some wrapped in shrouds of patched fabric, no ornaments, no weapons. At the very end, they ran out of everything, even tradition. The wedding at Hvalsey becomes doubly tragic in this light. That church with its imported sandstone and oak beams was a symbol of permanence, yet within a generation, its congregation became ghosts. The last Norse Greenlander may have died alone, watching the horizon for a ship that would arrive centuries too late. The church bells that once rang over Greenland's fjords did more than call the faithful to prayer. They anchored the Norse to an identity that became a fatal rigidity. Christianity arrived with the first settlers, a badge of European civility in what they saw as a savage land. By 1200, Greenland boasted its own bishopric at Garthar, complete with a cathedral, tithes, and a scriptorium where scribes painstakingly copied Latin texts. This wasn't just religion, it was a cultural lifeline to Norway and Rome, a way to shout across the icy expanse, "We are still Europeans," but that very insistence may have sealed their doom. Consider the stark contrast with their Viking ancestors. When Norse pagans first settled Iceland centuries earlier, they absorbed indigenous practices without hesitation, adoptive fishing techniques from the Irish, turf house designs from the Sami. Pragmatism trumped dogma, yet in Greenland the Church's influence fossilized their worldview. Excavations at Garthar reveal imported communion wine strainers and fragments of a bishop's lead seal, while Inuit hunting camps just miles away yield not a single crucifix or rosary bead. The message was clear: to be Norse was to reject scraling ways, even if those ways meant survival. The clergy's power over daily life cannot be overstated. Tithes demanded precious resources: ivory, walrus hides, even live polar bears sent as gifts to popes. These were not optional gestures, they were proof of Greenland's membership in Christendom. When a ship arrived in 1328 carrying a new bishop, he brought no iron or grain, but a cargo of ornate vestments and a demand for repairs to Garthar's stone walls. The symbolism is crushing: a starving colony prioritizing cathedral mortar over storehouse supplies. Worse still, the Church's calendar dictated their rhythm in a land where nature laughed at European schedules. Norse farmers sowed barley in May because the liturgical calendar said so, even as Greenland's growing seasons shrank. They fasted during Lent, denying themselves precious seal meat when winter reserves ran low, while the Inuit feasted. Archaeologists find seal bones in Norse middens conspicuously absent during spring, a grim adherence to doctrine even as children's bones show signs of scurvy. The psychological toll resonates in their final artifacts. At a farm in Hvalsey, someone carved a crucifix from driftwood with a rough inscription, "Lord, have mercy." Nearby lies a broken chess piece, a king, its face worn smooth by anxious fingers. These weren't just objects, they were last-ditch prayers to a distant god in a world where the Inuits' animist spirits seemed far more present. When the last bishop died in 1378, no replacement came. The silence from Rome was louder than any glacier's crash, yet the cruelest twist lies in what might have been. Norse sagas mention a rogue priest in the 1200s who learned kayak building from the Inuit, only to be defrocked for consorting with heathens. Imagine an alternate history where that priest's knowledge spread: Viking longships retrofitted with sealskin hulls for ice travel, hunters adopting harpoons instead of starving cattle. But dogma prevailed. By the end, even their faith turned hollow. The last graves contain no crosses, just bodies curled in fetal positions, not the posture of Christian burial, but of people who died alone, whispering to gods their church had told them didn't exist. The bones of the Greenland Vikings tell a silent, devastating story, one of bodies breaking under the weight of relentless hunger. In the final layers of Norse graves, skeletons curl inward like dried leaves, their spines twisted by years of malnutrition. Rib cages protrude sharply, bearing the unmistakable hallmarks of chronic starvation. One young woman's remains, discovered near the western settlement, showed lesions on her skull and bowing of the leg bones, classic signs of rickets, a disease caused by severe vitamin D deficiency. Without sunlight during endless winters and lacking fatty fish or seal blubber in their diet, their bodies literally crumbled from within. Livestock bones from the same period reveal an equally grim picture. Early Norse farms yielded robust cattle bones, thick with evidence of healthy herds, but as the climate cooled, these bones grew stunted and brittle. By the 1400s, sheep and cattle stood half the size of their ancestors, their remains showing stress fractures from malnutrition. In desperation, Norse farmers began slaughtering newborn calves, a catastrophic decision for a society dependent on dairy. Without milk, children's teeth developed poorly, leaving them vulnerable to infections that left telltale abscesses in excavated jaws. The most heartbreaking evidence comes from middens, trash heaps that became diaries of decline. Early layers overflow with butchered cattle and sheep bones, but later deposits contain tiny bird skeletons, fox bones cracked open for marrow, and even the remains of rats. At one eastern settlement farm, archaeologists found a dog's skull with knife marks circling the brain cavity. Someone had eaten the family pet. Worse still were the coprolites, fossilized human feces, which revealed parasitic infections from consuming rotten meat. These weren't just hungry people, they were poisoning themselves with decayed scraps. Disease compounded the crisis. Ice cores from Greenland's glaciers contained traces of lead and mercury, likely from European trade goods leaching into their water supply. Skeletons show arthritic joints, likely from hauling heavy loads in place of weakened livestock, and spinal deformities from years spent huddled against the cold. A mass grave near Garthar held a dozen bodies with identical dental grooves, a sign they'd used their teeth to strip sinew for thread when no other materials remained. Yet the cruelest twist wasn't just the suffering, it was the avoidability. Inuit middens from the same period overflow with seal and whale bones, proof of abundant protein just beyond Norse reach. The Vikings' refusal to adopt marine hunting left them gnawing on shoe leather while their neighbors feasted. Pride, perhaps, or the church's dietary laws, but the result was etched in bone. By the end, even the graves grew shallow, bodies buried without coffins in frozen earth too hard to dig. The last Greenland Vikings didn't just fade away. They starved in slow motion, surrounded by a sea full of food they wouldn't touch. To understand why the Greenland Vikings vanished while the Inuit thrived, look no further than a single artifact, a rusted iron plow. Buried in the frozen soil near a Norse farmstead, this tool symbolizes their unshakable commitment to European farming traditions, even as the land screamed for change. The Vikings arrived in Greenland with a playbook perfected in Norway's fertile valleys: plant barley, raise cattle, build barns. For centuries, this worked until the Little Ice Age turned their pastures to tundra. Yet they kept plowing frozen fields, dragging starving livestock to graze on land that could no longer sustain them. Meanwhile, just miles away, the Inuit moved with the seasons, their survival hinging not on rigid tradition, but on fluid adaptation. The differences couldn't have been starker. Norse farmers measured wealth in cows, animals that demanded vast quantities of hay, a crop that failed as summers shortened. When pastures withered, they culled herds to the brink of collapse rather than switch to more resilient food sources. Excavations reveal a grim pattern: cattle bones grow progressively smaller over time, the animals stunted by malnutrition. By contrast, the Inuit measured wealth in mobility. Their sled dogs could haul entire villages across ice floes in pursuit of seals, while Norse cattle stood shackled in crumbling barns. Where the Vikings saw a failed harvest, the Inuit saw a shifting buffet: migrating whales in spring, fat-rich seals in winter, Arctic char trapped beneath ice. Technology tells the same tale. Norse hunting gear, iron-tipped spears, wooden boats, was designed for European forests, not Arctic pack ice. Attempts to hunt walrus often ended in disaster, with men drowning in freezing waters or crushed by shifting ice. Meanwhile, the Inuits' toggle-headed harpoons, carved from walrus ivory themselves, allowed them to strike seals from kayaks with lethal precision. Even their needles were superior, curved bone tools that stitched waterproof sealskin parkas, while Norse woolens soaked through in storms. A single Inuit invention could have revolutionized Norse survival: the kajak, a nimble kayak that turned hunters into shadows on the water. Yet the Vikings clung to their heavy-oared boats, useless when fjords froze solid. Perhaps the most tragic divide was culinary. Norse dietary laws, influenced by church doctrine, forbade eating seals during Lent, a death sentence when stored grain ran low. Middens show they starved next to seas teeming with protein, their teeth grinding down on bark bread, while the Inuit rendered seal blubber into lamp oil and food. The Vikings even disdained fish, a staple in Norway, perhaps because netting them required labor they'd allocated to failing farms. At a western settlement midden, archaeologists found cod bones, but only in layers from the colony's final years, a desperate last resort. Cultural identity became their cage. The Norse saw themselves as Europeans, a distinction etched into every turf church and woven wool tunic. To adopt Inuit ways would mean surrendering that identity, unthinkable for a people who'd named their colony Greenland to lure settlers from civilized Bergen. A 14th century account describes Norse hunters watching Inuit spear seals through ice holes, then returning empty-handed to farms where children whimpered with hunger. The unspoken question lingers: why didn't they learn? Pride, fear, or simply the crushing weight of tradition, passed down from ancestors who'd never imagined a world where cows couldn't save them? In the end, the land imposed its own verdict. The Inuits' bone tools outlasted Norse iron, their leather clothing proved warmer than woven wool, and their flexible social structures adapted where Norse hierarchies collapsed. When archaeologists uncover a Norse farm, they find silence, abandoned tools, half-knitted yarn, the skeleton of a dog eaten to its hooves. But an Inuit winter camp from the same era bursts with life: harpoon heads ready for the hunt, lamps still stained with seal oil, toys carved from walrus tusk. The Vikings didn't disappear because Greenland was uninhabitable. They disappeared because they tried to inhabit it on Europe's terms, rather than its own. The wedding at Hvalsey in 1408 wasn't just a celebration, it was the last flickering candle of Norse Greenland. Sigrid Bjørnstadtyr and Thorstein Olafsson exchanged vows in a sandstone church that had stood for generations, its walls echoing with psalms one final time. Their marriage contract, preserved in Icelandic records, remains the colony's last written gasp. After that day, the historical record falls eerily quiet, broken only by fragmented accounts of ships glimpsing smoke from distant fjords or spotting shadowy figures along the coast. A German vessel blown off course in 1410 reported seeing armed men onshore who vanished into the mist when approached. Another crew in 1424 claimed to have found abandoned farms with meals still rotting on tables, as if the inhabitants had stepped out moments before. By the 1500s, when European ships began regularly venturing back to Greenland's waters, the silence was absolute. A Danish expedition in 1540 landed near the eastern settlement expecting to trade with descendants of the Norse. Instead, they discovered overgrown fields, collapsed sod roofs, and the skeletal remains of livestock still tethered to posts, the most haunting find. A single set of human footprints frozen in mud near Hvalsey's ruins, sizable enough to belong to an adult, but with no body to account for them. The cruise log describes rifling through empty homes where personal possessions lay undisturbed, rusted knives beside half-carved walrus tusks, wooden bowls still crusted with dried food, even a child's mitten tucked beneath a bed. Everything suggested sudden departure, yet nothing explained where they'd gone. The silence becomes even stranger when you consider Greenland's strategic location. Whaling ships and explorers crisscrossed the North Atlantic throughout the 1500s, yet not one credible account mentions encountering Norse speakers. A Portuguese captain's log from 1520 describes meeting Inuit hunters near Disco Bay, who traded narwhal tusks using hand signals, no trace of the Old Norse that had been spoken there for centuries. Even the Inuit oral traditions tell of finding empty stone houses, not conflicts with pale-skinned strangers. The Vikings didn't leave behind stories of their demise because there was no one left to tell them. Perhaps the most unsettling clue lies in what wasn't missing. Excavations show no mass graves, no heaps of weapons suggesting a last stand. Jewelry and silver prized loot for any attacker remained untouched in buried storage chests. At Gardar, the bishop's crozier still lay in the cathedral ruins, its ivory inlay intact. This wasn't conquest or catastrophe, it was evaporation. One theory suggests the last survivors may have attempted a desperate exodus by boat, their skeletal remains now scattered across the ocean floor. Others believe small bands held on in isolated valleys for decades, their final fires dying unseen. The truth may lie in an unexpected place, Iceland's gene pool. Modern DNA studies reveal a curious spike of Inuit ancestry appearing abruptly in the 16th century. Centuries before sustained contact, could a handful of Norse survivors have assimilated with their indigenous neighbors, trading crucifixes for harpoons? It's a tantalizing possibility, one that would mean the Greenland Vikings didn't entirely vanish, they simply ceased being Viking. Norway's abandonment of Greenland didn't happen overnight, it was a slow unraveling, like a rope fraying strand by strand until nothing remained to hold the weight. The first threads began to snap in 1349, when the Black Death reached Bergen, Greenland's lifeline to Europe. The plague didn't just kill people, it obliterated the very networks that sustained the colony. Shipowners, merchants, even the bishop's staff perished in waves, leaving few willing to risk the treacherous Arctic route for dwindling profits. A single ledger from Bergen's port, dated 1355, tells the story, where once 20 ships a year sailed west, now only 3 or 4 ventured forth, their holds half empty. Greenland's ivory had already lost value, but now even the flow of basic necessities, iron, timber, grain, dried to a trickle. Political chaos accelerated the neglect. Norway's monarchy, weakened by plague and succession crises, merged with Denmark in 1387 under the Kalmar Union. Overnight, Greenland became a forgotten outpost in a sprawling Nordic empire fixated on Baltic trade and German alliances. A royal decree from 1409, discovered in Copenhagen's archives, sums up the indifference. Officials were ordered to inquire whether the Greenland voyage might be resumed. as if the colony's survival were a mere afterthought. No ships were sent. The last bishop assigned to Gardar died in 1378. For decades, no replacement was even nominated. By the 1400s, Greenland existed in European minds as a half-legendary place, marked on maps with doodles of walruses and icebergs, but absent from any policy discussion. The psychological impact on Greenland's Norse was devastating. Imagine a farmstead in the eastern settlement, its residents scanning the horizon each summer for sails that never appeared. Letters from the period, preserved in Icelandic monasteries, reveal growing despair. One penned in 1385 by a priest named Ivar Bardarson pleads, "We are as sheep without a shepherd, forgotten by God and king." Another, from a layman named Hrold, describes dismantling a church bell to smelt into nails, a sacrilege born of sheer necessity. Without Norwegian iron, they couldn't repair fishing hooks to catch cod or forge knives to butcher their emaciated cattle. Even their faith became a burden. Tithes meant for Bergen's archbishop piled up in storehouses, useless as the ice encroached. The cruelest cut came in the 1420s, when Norway's crown actively discouraged Greenland voyages. A harbour master's log from Bergen records turning away a ship bound for the colony, citing, "No profitable cargo expected." Without official patronage, private merchants abandoned the route entirely. The last recorded contact was a storm-swept vessel blown off course in 1484. Its crew reported seeing smoke from a fjord, but didn't bother to land. By then, Greenland's Norse had become ghosts in their own homeland, Europeans in blood, but abandoned by Europe itself. Norway's neglect wasn't just indifference. It was a death sentence written in missed opportunities. Ice cores from Greenland's glaciers reveal a chilling detail. Layers of volcanic ash from eruptions in Iceland during the 1400s. Had ships still been sailing, they could have brought news of new farming techniques or tools developed during Scandinavia's post-plague recovery. Instead, the Norse Greenlanders withered in isolation, their plows breaking against frozen soil while the world moved on. The story of their collapse isn't just about ice and hunger, it's about what happens when the threads of connection snap, leaving a people stranded not just geographically, but in time. Some historians cling to a tantalizing possibility that Greenland's Vikings didn't vanish into extinction, but simply packed up and left. Could entire communities have staged a mass exodus, sailing east to Iceland or west toward the faint memory of Vinland? The idea feels almost romantic. Longships cutting through icy waters, families clutching heirlooms as they abandoned their crumbling churches for greener shores. But the evidence, or rather the lack of it, paints a far bleaker picture. Take Iceland first, the most logical refuge. Its sagas meticulously document arrivals from Norway, Ireland, even distant Constantinople, yet not a single surviving text mentions an influx of Greenlanders during the critical 14th or 15th centuries. Census records from Icelandic monasteries show no sudden spikes in population, no clusters of refugees with Greenlandic names. Even genetic studies reveal no trace of distinct Norse Greenland ancestry in Iceland's medieval gene pool. If families did escape, they arrived silently, assimilating without leaving so much as a rune stone to mark their passage. Vinland, the Norse name for North America, seems an even less likely destination. The sagas describe Leif Erikson's brief settlement at Elance Ox Meadows around the year 1000, but by the time Greenland's colonies collapsed, that venture had been abandoned for centuries. Excavations at Newfoundland show no signs of later occupation, no Greenlandic tools, no skeletal remains with telltale signs of Arctic malnutrition. The notion of a desperate westward migration crumbles under the sheer impracticality of it. Starving farmers, their ships rotting without imported nails, attempting a transatlantic crossing their ancestors had managed only at the height of Norse naval prowess. A darker theory lingers in the silence. Perhaps the last survivors did attempt escape but never reached land. Shipwrecks along the Labrador coast occasionally yield Norse artifacts, a broken rivet, a piece of rope, but these likely date from earlier exploratory voyages. The real tragedy may be that any Greenlanders who took to the sea in those final years met their end in the water, their boats overwhelmed by storms or ice. A single Icelandic chronicle from 1476 mentions fishermen spotting a derelict vessel adrift near Greenland, its sails in tatters and deck empty. Was it a ghost ship from the last failed exodus? The record offers no answers. The most plausible scenario is also the most haunting. There was no grand migration, no dramatic farewell, just a slow dwindling. Families held on as long as they could, then one winter, the hearth fires didn't rekindle, a child's cough turned fatal without medicine, a fishing party never returned from the ice. The last Greenland Viking may have died alone in a turf house, watching the door for neighbors who no longer existed. When historians say, no evidence of migration, what they mean is this: the bones are still in Greenland. All of them, among the glaciers and abandoned Norse farms. There's another shadow lurking, one with sails and swords. Could pirates have delivered the final blow to Greenland's Vikings? Some archaeologists point to unsettling clues: homes burned too evenly to be accidents, chests pried open with tools not of Norse make, and a sudden disappearance of personal valuables in certain settlements. The timing aligns with a dark era when Basque whalers and English privateers began prowling the North Atlantic, hunting not just whales but vulnerable coastal communities. Take the case of a Western settlement longhouse excavated in the 1990s. Inside, a shattered iron strongbox lay empty, its lock twisted off by what experts say was a pry bar, an implement the Norse didn't use. Nearby, a woman's bronze brooch, the kind typically buried with the dead, was found trampled into the dirt near a doorway, as if torn off during a struggle. Even more telling, a layer of charred timbers blankets these artifacts, but the fire pattern suggests deliberate torching rather than a cooking pit gone awry. Historical records from Europe add weight to the theory. Basque whaling logs from the early 1500s describe northern villages ripe for picking, though they don't name Greenland outright. A Bristol merchant's ledger from 1497 lists strange ivory, sold at auction, walrus tusks matching Greenland's stockpile, yet no legal trade with the colony existed by then. And then there's the curious account of a Danish missionary in 1721 who interviewed Inuit elders about the Norse. Their oral traditions spoke of big boats with men who stole and burned, arriving years before the Inuit themselves moved into the empty fjords. But here's the twist: if pirates came, they weren't the Hollywood kind. These weren't swashbucklers after gold, but starving opportunists. The Little Ice Age had squeezed Europe too. Desperate sailors might have raided for food stores, wool clothing, even livestock, anything to survive another winter. A cache of Norse-style wool garments found in a Basque whaling station in Labrador hints at exactly this, yet the pirate theory alone doesn't explain the totality of the silence. Why no mass graves? Why leave behind perfectly usable iron tools? Perhaps the raids were the final straw for a people already broken by hunger and isolation. Imagine a settlement already teetering on collapse, its children weak with scurvy, when armed strangers storm the shore. Some flee inland, only to perish in the icy wilderness. Others are taken as slaves, their voices lost to history, the few left behind, too few to rebuild. The most haunting evidence comes not from what was taken, but what was left behind. At a farmstead in Vatnajökull, archaeologists found a small wooden crucifix stuffed with wool, a makeshift doll, perhaps dropped by a child during a frantic escape. Nearby, the bones of a guard dog lay near the threshold, its skull split by an axe blow. These aren't the orderly remnants of a planned departure, they're the scars of a community interrupted, frozen in a moment of terror. Pirates might not have killed every last Greenlander, but they could have shattered the fragile web holding the colonies together. A single raid might have severed trade routes, scattered survivors, and severed the last threads of contact with Europe. By the time the next ship arrived, there was no one left to tell the tale, just empty homes and the wind howling through broken doorways. What makes a culture thrive isn't just strength, it's the ability to change. The Norse settlers in Greenland arrived with a toolkit honed in the fjords of Norway: iron plows for tilling rich soil, woolen cloaks for drizzly winters, and sturdy longships built for open water. These were brilliant innovations for Europe, but in the Arctic they became anchors dragging them toward disaster, while the Inuit continually refined their harpoons, kayaks, and clothing to match Greenland's harsh rhythms. The Vikings clung to traditions that grew more obsolete with each passing winter. Consider their boats. Norse longships, masterpieces of naval engineering in the North Sea, were hopeless in ice-choked fjords. Their deep drafts required open water, leaving hunters stranded when winter froze the shorelines solid. Meanwhile, the Inuits' kajak lightweight sealskin kayaks could glide through narrow ice channels with barely a ripple. Archaeological digs tell the story. Norse sites yield broken oars and rusted boat nails, while Inuit camps overflow with finely carved paddles and harpoon rests designed specifically for kayak hunting. The Vikings had seen these vessels in action. Sagas mention encounters with skin boats, yet never adopted them. Instead, they kept patching their heavy wooden ships with dwindling supplies of imported iron until the last planks rotted away. The same stubbornness applied to hunting. Norse spears designed for boar and deer in Scandinavian forests shattered against walrus hide or glanced off seal skulls. Their solution: throw more men at the problem. Sagas describe hunting parties of 20 or 30 Vikings hauling a single walrus carcass back to camp, a wasteful effort compared to the Inuits' toggle-headed harpoons. These ingenious tools, tipped with bone barbs that rotated inside the prey's flesh, allowed one hunter to kill seals from a distance with near-surgical precision. Excavations at Norse sites reveal piles of butchered walrus bones, many showing hack marks from repeated failed strikes. Just a few miles away, Inuit middens contain cleanly punctured seal skulls, each hole perfectly sized for a harpoon point. Even their clothing became a liability. Norse woolens, ideal for Norway's damp chill, absorbed moisture like sponges in Greenland's sub-zero temperatures. Wet wool loses insulation fast, a death sentence when temperatures plunge. The Inuit, by contrast, wore layered sealskin parkas with waterproof stitching so tight it repelled blizzards. At a Norse farm in Vatnajökull, archaeologists found the body of a man who died wearing a tunic patched with 16 layers of wool, a desperate attempt to stay warm with the wrong material. Nearby Inuit graves from the same era reveal sleek, hooded anoraks lined with caribou fur, their seams still flexible after 6 centuries. The tragedy isn't that the Norse lacked opportunities to learn. The two cultures coexisted for nearly 400 years, ample time to adopt kayaks, harpoons, or parkas, but every artifact suggests they viewed Inuit technology as beneath them. A rune stone found near the eastern settlement bears a telling inscription: "We remain true to our ways." It wasn't just practicality at stake, it was identity. To build a kajak would mean admitting European methods failed. To wear sealskin might make them scralings in their own eyes. This cultural rigidity extended beyond tools. Norse farming practices, perfectly suited to Norway's mild summers, became suicidal in Greenland's shortening growing seasons. They kept planting barley despite repeated crop failures, sowed fields in May because the church calendar dictated it, and starved next to fjords teeming with Arctic char. The Inuit, watching this folly, didn't farm at all. They followed the food, whether seals on winter ice or salmon in summer streams. Perhaps the starkest evidence lies in the trash heaps. Inuit sites overflow with refined tools: needles for sewing waterproof seams, ulu knives for processing blubber, even snow goggles carved from driftwood. Norse middens, by contrast, reveal endless recycling: broken scythes hammered into nails, patched tunics darned until threadbare, soup pots mended with walrus hide glue. They weren't just running out of resources, they were running out of workarounds. The bitter truth: Greenland didn't kill the Norse, their own cultural inflexibility did. When the last ship from Norway failed to arrive, they had no backup plan, just empty storehouses, crumbling boats, and the creeping realization that their ancestors' wisdom no longer applied. Meanwhile, the Inuit thrived by doing what the Vikings never could, treating survival as a question, not a tradition. The very land that sustained the Greenland Vikings turned against them, not suddenly, but through decades of slow, creeping destruction. Each summer, Norse farmers drove their cattle and sheep to the same overgrazed pastures, their hooves churning fragile Arctic soil into dust. Unlike the rich meadows of Norway, Greenland's grasslands were a thin veneer over permafrost, easily stripped bare by hungry livestock. Archaeologists examining soil layers near abandoned farms find a startling shift. Deep, healthy root systems in the earliest deposits give way to compacted, lifeless dirt by the 14th century. The Vikings didn't just run out of food, they starved atop land they'd rendered barren. Deforestation accelerated the crisis. With no native trees larger than dwarf willow, the Norse relied on driftwood and imported timber for everything from boat repairs to roof beams. But as trade dwindled, they turned to their meager forests with increasing desperation. Pollen samples from Greenland's lakes tell the story: birch and juniper, once common near settlements, virtually disappear from the record by 1350. Without tree roots to anchor the soil, winter winds scoured the exposed earth, burying fields under suffocating layers of sand. At a farmstead in Vatnajökull, excavators uncovered a doorframe half buried in silt, its wood grain worn smooth by abrasive grit, testament to relentless erosion. The consequences rippled through every aspect of life. Shrinking pastures forced farmers to cull their herds earlier each autumn, leaving too few animals to breed back healthy numbers. Cattle bones from late-period middens show signs of stunted growth, and brittle limbs the telltale marks of malnutrition from grazing on sun-baked scrubgrass. As pastures failed, families turned to the sea, but here too, their habits proved destructive. Norse middens overflow with seal bones from younger, smaller animals, suggesting they overhunted nearshore populations before learning sustainable Inuit techniques. Even their waste became a weapon against them. Turf cutting for house construction stripped away the very vegetation that stabilized slopes. At Gardar, the bishop's estate, runoff from denuded hillsides buried irrigation channels under feet of silt, choking what little arable land remained. Ice cores from Greenland's glaciers capture the scale of the disaster. Layers of wind-blown dust from the 1400s spike to levels unseen in centuries, coinciding precisely with the colony's final collapse. The cruelest irony: the Inuit thrived in the same landscape by working with its rhythms rather than against them. Where Norse farms became ecological graveyards, Inuit winter camps left barely a footprint, their seal skin tents requiring no timber, their mobility preventing overhunting. The Vikings might have learned from them, had pride not blinded them to the truth written in the crumbling soil beneath their feet. In the end, the Greenland Norse didn't just battle the elements, they waged war on the land itself and lost. As conditions worsened, Greenland's fragile social fabric began to unravel from the top down. The first to vanish were the elites, the bishops, chieftains, and wealthy farmers who'd once presided over feasts in great halls lined with imported tapestries. Church records from Bergen note a sudden exodus of clergy in the late 1300s, including the Bishop of Gardar, who boarded a ship for Norway in 1378 and never returned. Without these leaders, the tithes and trade networks that sustained the colonies crumbled. Imagine a farmhand in the eastern settlement, watching the last sail vanish over the horizon, knowing the men who'd once distributed iron tools and blessed the harvest were now sipping wine in warmer lands. The hierarchy hadn't just organized society, it had been the glue holding survival together. Chieftains controlled critical resources, access to hunting grounds, stockpiles of fermented whey for winter, and most crucially, connections to European traders. When they abandoned their estates, the remaining farmers found themselves stranded with no one to coordinate walrus hunts or negotiate for grain shipments. Excavations at elite homesteads reveal eerie clues to their flight. At Garthar, the bishop's residence yielded a cache of rusted keys and empty strongboxes, their contents hastily removed. Nearby, a storage room still held rotting barrels of dried fish, abandoned provisions that might have fed a starving family for months. For the lower classes, collapse came in slow, suffocating stages. Without imported nails, they couldn't repair fishing boats. Without priests, marriages and baptisms went unrecorded, eroding the very rituals that defined their identity. At a remote farm in the western settlement, archaeologists uncovered a wooden tally stick notched with marks, likely an attempt by illiterate survivors to track dwindling food stores, once record-keeping vanished. The deepest tragedy, these were people who'd once thrived under Norse law. Now, with no courts to settle disputes or authorities to enforce order, neighbors turned on each other. A mass grave near Hvalsey holds 6 skeletons, 2 with axe wounds to the skull, buried without Christian rites during the colony's final years. The elite exodus created a vacuum that desperation filled. With no ships arriving, blacksmiths hoarded scraps of iron, leaving farmers to till fields with antler picks. Skilled hunters, once rewarded with fine wool cloaks, now kept their catches secret rather than share with starving communities. The last generations lived in a twilight world where Norse customs blurred with brute survival, digging up graves to reuse coffin wood for fuel, repurposing church bells as fishing weights, even carving runes into walrus tusks, pleading for Odin's mercy alongside fading crosses. By the end, the settlements weren't just physically isolated, they'd become culturally adrift. A child born in Greenland in 1400 would have heard stories of Europe, but never seen a ship from its shores. The sagas spoke of kings and bishops, yet none had visited in living memory. When the final handful of survivors huddled around their last fire, they weren't Vikings anymore, just hungry people in a land that had outlasted them. Inuit oral traditions hold fragments of a mystery, shadowy encounters with pale-skinned strangers who vanished into Greenland's icy silence. Passed down through generations, these stories speak of kavlunate, a term meaning eyebrow people, describing foreigners with fair hair and beards. One account tells of hunters finding stone houses by the fjords, their hearths cold but tools still hanging on walls, as if the occupants had stepped out moments before. Another describes a lone figure clad in strange wool garments, glimpsed at dusk near an abandoned farmstead, who disappeared when approached. The details are sparse, filtered through centuries of retelling, and later conflated with encounters with European whalers. Yet these fleeting whispers offer the only indigenous perspective on the Norse disappearance, a puzzle viewed from the other side. The challenge lies in untangling time. Many Inuit stories collected in the 1800s blend memories of the Norse with far more recent contact with Danish colonists, but a few rare accounts, recorded by early ethnographers before outside influence reshaped oral history, stand apart. One elder's tale from the Upernavik region describes discovering a group of sickly foreigners near a crumbling stone building, their skin stretched tight over bones. The Inuit offered seal meat, but the strangers recoiled, pointing to a wooden cross, a possible nod to Christian dietary restrictions during Lent. Another narrative from East Greenland speaks of a battle near a place called Kanjek, where Norse warriors in iron clashed with Inuit hunters armed with harpoons. The specifics blur, but the underlying tension feels visceral. Two cultures meeting at cross purposes, one flourishing, the other unraveling. The most haunting stories aren't of conflict, but of eerie absence. An Inuit hunter's account from the 19th century describes stumbling upon a Norse farmstead untouched by time, a half-carved walrus tusk on a workbench, a child's mitten under a bed, even a pot of hardened porridge still on the hearth. No bodies, no signs of violence, just stillness. These narratives align uncannily with archaeological finds, like the Norse skeletal remains curled in fetal positions, suggesting slow starvation rather than massacre. One Greenlandic legend even hints at assimilation, telling of a blue-eyed woman taken in by an Inuit family, her weaving skills revered but her origins never discussed. The truth may lie in the gaps between these stories and the soil. At a site called Nuniak, Inuit oral histories led archaeologists to a Norse iron axe head buried in a Thule winter house, proof of contact, if not comprehension. Elsewhere, carvings of European-style ships appear on Inuit amulets, suggesting fascination with the stranger's technology, yet the overwhelming impression from these accounts isn't of conquest or collaboration, but of parallel existence. The Norse weren't conquered, they faded like footprints in drifting snow, while the Inuit watched from a distance, puzzled by their refusal to learn. What lingers isn't just the mystery of how the Vikings vanished, but how little they were remembered by those who outlasted them. Unlike later colonizers, the Norse left no linguistic traces in Inuit dialects, no adopted technologies beyond a handful of traded goods. Their legacy was so faint that when Danish missionaries arrived in the 1700s, the Inuit spoke of the ruins as if they'd always been empty, ghostly relics of a people who'd already become legends in their own land. The last Norse Greenlander may have died within sight of an Inuit hunting camp, their cultures separated by more than language or skin, but by the unbridgeable gulf between adaptation and extinction. Digging through layers of frozen soil at Gardar in the 1920s, archaeologists uncovered more than just ruins. They found a time capsule of collapse. The bishop's seat, once the spiritual and economic heart of Norse Greenland, yielded a trove of clues: a broken wax seal from the papal archives, rusted iron nails painstakingly salvaged and straightened for reuse, and most hauntingly, a ledger listing tithes paid in walrus ivory long after trade with Europe had ceased. These excavations peeled back centuries of silence, revealing a society unraveling stitch by stitch, but it wasn't until modern science turned its gaze to Greenland's ice sheets that the full picture emerged. Ice cores drilled deep into Greenland's glaciers act as frozen history books, each layer a snapshot of the atmosphere from centuries past. When scientists analyzed these cores in the 1980s, they discovered a chilling pattern: traces of lead pollution spiking during the Norse settlement's peak, then vanishing abruptly by the 1400s. The lead came from European silver mines, carried across the Atlantic on trade ships. Its disappearance wasn't just a footnote, it was the smoking gun proving Greenland had been cut off from the world. Pollen trapped in the ice told an equally grim tale: a sharp decline in birch and grass particles as the Little Ice Age strangled the land, replaced by blowing dust from eroded, lifeless soil. The most startling revelation came from oxygen isotopes, chemical signatures that act as ancient thermometers. They showed summers growing shorter and colder decade by decade, with the 1300s bearing the brunt. One core from the Die 3 drilling site captured a single catastrophic year, 1362, where snowfall was so heavy it buried pastures under 10 extra feet of snow, a death sentence for livestock already teetering on starvation. These weren't gradual changes, they were climatic hammer blows, each one shrinking the margin for error until there was none left. Modern archaeology has paired these climate snapshots with on-the-ground discoveries to rewrite the narrative. At a farm in Vatnajökull, soil analyses revealed something grim. Norse farmers had unknowingly poisoned their own fields. Their European-style manure fertilization, ideal for temperate climates, introduced parasites that thrived in Greenland's cold, creating a toxic buildup that stunted crops. Meanwhile, Inuit middens nearby showed thriving seal hunting camps, proof that while the Norse fought against their failing farms, their neighbors adapted to the changing environment. Even the bones tell a story technology can now decipher. Isotope analysis of Norse skeletons from the final decades shows plummeting levels of marine protein, evidence they doubled down on starving cattle rather than embrace the sea. One young woman's teeth revealed she'd survived 5 successive winters of near starvation before succumbing. her body a testament to stubbornness in the face of change. The greatest irony, the Inuit thrived through the same climatic shifts that doomed the Norse, their flexible lifestyles etched into the archaeological record. Where Norse sites show layers of desperation, reused tools, patched clothing, gnawed bones, Inuit layers from the same period reveal innovation, refined harpoon designs, new seal oil lamp styles, even trade goods from as far as Alaska. Today's climate scientists use Greenland's ice cores not just to study the past, but to model our future. The little ice age that crushed the Vikings was a regional blip compared to the global changes now underway. Yet the lesson remains: adaptation isn't just about strength, it's about knowing when to let go of what no longer works. The Norse didn't fail because they were weak, they failed because their greatest strength, unyielding tradition, became their fatal flaw. As meltwater from those very glaciers now rises to reshape our world, their story feels less like ancient history and more like a warning etched in ice. Genetic evidence shatters one of the most persistent myths about the Greenland Vikings, that they intermarried with the Inuit and left surviving descendants. Modern DNA studies of Greenland's indigenous populations reveal a startling absence of Norse ancestry, disproving romanticized theories of assimilation. When researchers sequenced the genomes of contemporary Inuit communities, they found no traces of medieval Scandinavian DNA, not even the faint statistical whispers that would suggest distant intermarriage. The silence in the genes is as absolute as the silence in the ruins. This genetic blank slate tells a profound story. For centuries, scholars speculated that the last Norse might have blended with Inuit communities, trading their woolen tunics for sealskin parkas and their runestones for harpoons. But science now confirms the two groups remained culturally and biologically separate. One study from 2014 examined over 300 Inuit individuals from across Greenland, searching for markers linked to medieval Norse populations. The result: less than 0.2% shared ancestry, statistically insignificant, likely from much later Danish colonial contact. Even among the Inuits' oldest oral histories, there are no tales of blonde-haired children or families with Norse customs. The Vikings didn't fade into the local population, they vanished from it entirely. The implications are chilling. If the Norse had assimilated, their DNA would have left a trail, especially since Inuit populations were smaller and more isolated during the period of overlap. Instead, the genetic record suggests minimal interaction beyond occasional trade or conflict. A 2019 study of ancient Thule Inuit remains from the 14th century found no evidence of Norse admixture, despite the two groups coexisting in Greenland for at least 200 years. Even at the height of Norse settlement, when the colonies numbered in the thousands, there was no meaningful integration. Why does this matter? Because it transforms our understanding of the collapse. If assimilation didn't happen, then the final Norse survivors likely died isolated and alone. No hybrid communities, no gradual adoption of Inuit lifeways. Archaeologists find no Norse artifacts repurposed in Inuit sites beyond a handful of traded items like iron nails or broken tools. No Norse-style houses appear in Thule villages, no Old Norse loanwords in the Inuit language. The cultural firewall was nearly absolute. The most telling clue lies in dietary isotopes extracted from Norse and Inuit bones. Even as the Vikings starved, their remains show they ate almost no marine mammals, the cornerstone of Inuit survival. Meanwhile, Inuit bones from the same period brim with seal and whale proteins. Two peoples shared an island, one thriving, the other perishing, separated not just by language but by an unbridgeable divide of tradition. The Vikings didn't disappear into the Inuit world, they clung to their own until it vanished beneath them, yet the genetic silence holds one final mystery. In Iceland of all places, there's a faint but detectable trace of Inuit DNA dating not to the Viking Age, but to the 1600s. This suggests that while the Norse never joined Inuit society, a handful of Inuit individuals may have eventually reached Europe, likely as curiosities or captives on whaling ships. The genetic legacy runs one way only, a bitter coda to a story of cultural collision without connection. The Greenland Vikings left no children behind, just bones, ruins, and questions buried in ice. The bishop's seat at Gardar once stood as Greenland's spiritual and political anchor, a sprawling complex with a cathedral, bishop's residence, and even a banquet hall where tithes of walrus ivory were weighed for shipment to Rome. In 1378, Bishop Elfur departed for Norway to report to his superiors, leaving behind a colony already fraying at the edges. He never returned. No replacement was ever sent. The silence that followed wasn't just administrative neglect, it was the unraveling of an entire civilization's connection to the world beyond the ice. Gardar's ruins tell a haunting story of this slow-motion abandonment. Excavations revealed a bishop's crozier, a ceremonial staff, left leaning against a wall as if its owner meant to retrieve it. Nearby, a chest of unused communion wafers, now petrified by centuries of Arctic cold, sits unopened. These weren't hastily discarded items, they were relics of a system that expected continuity. The last priest to officiate at Gardar likely died waiting for a ship that would never arrive, his final sermons echoing through an emptying cathedral. Records from Bergen's archdiocese add chilling context. A letter from 1402 describes a backlog of tithes from Greenland, labeled uncollectible due to hazardous conditions. Another, dated 1421, casually notes the diocese's budget no longer includes the Greenland voyage. What began as a temporary oversight hardened into institutional amnesia. By the time Rome officially dissolved the Greenland bishopric in 1537, it was a clerical footnote, a jurisdiction without a single living soul to oversee. The bishop's absence cascaded through daily life in ways both profound and practical. Without ordinations, marriages went unrecorded, children died unbaptized, and the rituals that once knit society together faded. At a farmstead near Hvalsey, archaeologists found a makeshift altar cobbled from driftwood, its surface scratched with runes mixing Latin prayers and older Norse invocations. The church's hierarchy had vanished, but faith twisted into something raw and desperate. Financial collapse followed spiritual isolation. Tithes paid in walrus tusks were the colony's economic engine, funding imports of iron, grain, and sacramental wine. When the bishop left, so did the ships. A ledger from Bergen's port lists a single vessel dispatched to Greenland in 1392. It turned back after encountering pack ice. Without these lifelines, the Norse couldn't even repair their own fishing hooks, let alone maintain the delicate balance of survival in the Arctic. Yet the most telling clue lies in what wasn't preserved. Greenland's last bishop took the diocese's records with him, or perhaps they mouldered in a forgotten chest. Either way, the colony's final decades exist only in fragments: a child's grave marked with a crudely carved cross, a rusted bell buried face down near a farm's threshold, as if someone hoped to muffle its peal forever. The bishopric didn't just disappear, it was erased by the very institution that created it, leaving behind stone walls and unanswered questions. What happened to the last priest at Gardar? Did he starve watching the horizon for sails, or did he walk into the snow one night, his vestments fluttering like a tattered flag? The ruins offer no answers, only silence where once there were hymns. The disappearance of the Greenland Vikings wasn't history's only vanishing act, but it was uniquely brutal. Compare their fate to the lost colony of Roanoke, where English settlers vanished from North Carolina's shores in the 1580s. Roanoke's mystery thrives on cryptic clues: the word Croatoan carved into a tree, abandoned possessions neatly stored. Theories range from assimilation with local tribes to massacre or forced relocation. Yet Roanoke's settlers lasted barely 3 years before disappearing, while Greenland's Norse clung to their identity for 4 centuries before crumbling. The difference: Roanoke vanished suddenly, swallowed by a landscape teeming with resources and potential allies. Greenland's doom was slow, inescapable, and amplified by an environment that offered no mercy and no retreat. The Maya collapse presents another stark contrast. Their great cities Tikal, Palenque, Kapan succumbed to drought, war, and political chaos between the 8th and 9th centuries. Yet the Maya people never truly vanished. They adapted, shifting from monumental kingdoms to smaller, resilient communities. Today, millions speak Mayan languages and preserve ancestral traditions. Greenland's Norse had no such fallback. When their European identity became unsustainable, there was no smaller niche to occupy, no alternate way of life to embrace. The Arctic doesn't permit half measures. You either master its rhythms or perish. What sets Greenland apart is the sheer weight of its isolation. The Roanoke colonists could have walked to other English settlements or indigenous villages if desperate. The Maya traded across vast networks. Even at their lowest ebb, they weren't utterly alone. But Greenland's Norse were marooned at the edge of the known world, their lifeline to Europe stretching 1,200 miles across the world's most treacherous seas. When that thread snapped, they had no neighbors to turn to except the Inuit, whose survival strategies they rejected. Climate pressures also differed radically. The Maya faced cyclical droughts, but their descendants farmed through the worst by digging deeper wells or planting hardier crops. Roanoke's colonists starved during a single brutal drought, yet the land itself remained fertile. Greenland's Norse battled a climatic double-bind. The Little Ice Age didn't just bring colder winters, it strangled their already precarious food systems year-round. Shorter summers meant less hay for livestock. Expanding sea ice blocked walrus hunts and trade ships alike. Even their attempts to adapt backfired. Overgrazing turned pastures to dust, and desperate overhunting depleted seal populations. Cultural rigidity magnified Greenland's tragedy. The Maya abandoned their cities but kept their language and gods. The Roanoke settlers might have blended with the Croatans, trading muskets for maize. But Norse identity was non-negotiable. Eating seal meat during Lent or paddling an Inuit kayak would have meant surrendering who they were. In the end, their refusal to change turned their greatest strength, unyielding Norse resilience, into their fatal flaw. The ruins tell the final, grim distinction. Roanoke's empty cabins fueled centuries of speculation. Maya pyramids became vine-shrouded mysteries. But Greenland's farms didn't just empty, they fossilized. A child's toy left on a bench, a half-carved ivory tusk, a door left ajar as if someone might return. These weren't scenes of panic, but of exhaustion. The last Greenland Viking didn't vanish in a storm or fall in battle. They simply closed their eyes one winter night and let the cold take them, knowing no one was left to notice. For all its historical tragedy, the Greenland Vikings' disappearance has spawned bizarrely modern legends, wild theories that ignore centuries of archaeological evidence in favor of extraterrestrials, cursed relics, or shadowy government cover-ups. One viral documentary even suggested UFOs abducted the entire colony, pointing to Norse carvings of sky chariots that were actually just stylized depictions of sunlight. These myths persist because they tap into something primal, our discomfort with unsolved mysteries. It's easier to imagine flashing lights whisking settlers away than to confront the slow, grinding horror of starvation in isolation. The supernatural curse theory gained traction after a 19th-century explorer claimed Inuit elders spoke of ghosts in the fjords, pale figures who supposedly vanished overnight. Sensationalized retellings omitted crucial context. These stories were metaphors for environmental collapse, not literal specters. Modern radiocarbon dating later confirmed the ruins showed no signs of sudden abandonment. Yet the myth endures, repackaged in paranormal podcasts and clickbait articles insisting the Norse angered ancient Arctic spirits. The truth: climate change plus cultural rigidity is somehow less satisfying than cursed runestones. Even more outlandish is the Atlantis-style disappearance theory, which posits the entire colony sank into the sea. Never mind that Greenland's bedrock is among the oldest on Earth, or that Norse farms sit firmly atop hillsides untouched by rising waters. Proponents cherry-pick vague medieval texts about lost lands, while ignoring satellite imagery showing every settlement still exactly where Vikings built them. The real mystery isn't geographical, it's why we'd rather invent sinking continents than study soil erosion. The most persistent myth casts the Inuit as aggressors who slaughtered the Norse, a narrative rooted in colonial bias rather than evidence. Early European explorers, unwilling to accept indigenous survival where superior Europeans failed, crafted tales of Inuit ambushes, yet forensic archaeology reveals no mass graves, no Norse skeletons with harpoon wounds, no burned strongholds. Inuit oral histories describe finding empty homes, not battles. This myth says more about its creators than history, the need to blame someone, anyone, for a collapse that was ultimately self-inflicted. What makes these theories so sticky? They weaponize the gaps in our knowledge, where science sees a puzzle gradual depopulation amid climatic shifts, mythmakers see a vacuum to fill with aliens or curses. The Greenland Vikings didn't need supernatural explanations. Their bones, their stunted livestock, and the very ice cores from their glaciers tell a complete enough story. Yet perhaps these wild theories serve a purpose, their flares shot into the dark, reminders that some vanishings haunt us precisely because their mundanity is the most terrifying thing of all. The story of Greenland's Vikings is more than a historical tragedy, it's a cautionary tale etched in ice and bone, one that echoes uncomfortably in our own era of climate upheaval and cultural reckoning. Their collapse wasn't caused by a single cataclysm, but by the slow intertwining of environmental shifts, rigid traditions, and economic fragility, a trifecta of vulnerabilities we recognize all too well today. Like us, they faced a changing climate. Unlike us, they lacked the tools or the willingness to adapt. Consider the parallels. The Norse arrived in Greenland during the medieval warm period, a centuries-long climate anomaly that made the Arctic margins deceptively habitable. Their entire way of life, grazing cattle, growing barley, exporting ivory, was built on climatic conditions that vanished as the Little Ice Age tightened its grip. Sound familiar? Modern agriculture, coastal cities, and supply chains are equally precariously perched on assumptions of stable weather patterns now unraveling before our eyes. The Vikings watched their pastures wither under unrelenting cold. We watch ours bake under record heat. Their fatal mistake wasn't just misjudging nature's volatility, was doubling down on strategies that worked in a world that no longer existed. Cultural inflexibility amplified the disaster. Faced with Inuit hunters who thrived on marine mammals, the Norse clung to their Scandinavian identity like a lifeline, rejecting life-saving innovations because they came from outsiders. This wasn't ignorance. They saw Inuit kayaks harpoon seals with lethal efficiency, but a deliberate choice to preserve their European-ness at all costs. Today's equivalent might be industries clinging to fossil fuels despite cleaner alternatives, or communities resisting urban densification as housing crises escalate. The psychological mechanism is the same. When change threatens identity, even survival instincts can falter. Economic dependence was the third thread in the noose. Greenland's ivory trade collapsed not because walrus disappeared, but because global markets shifted. African elephant tusks flooded Europe, and suddenly, no one needed their painstakingly hunted Arctic ivory. Their entire economy hinged on a single commodity vulnerable to distant disruptions, much like modern towns reliant on a single factory or crop. When the last trade ship failed to arrive, they lacked the diversity of skills to pivot. No one remembered how to smelt local iron or build boats without imported nails. Globalization giveth and globalization taketh away, yet the most unsettling lesson lies in what they didn't do. The Vikings had 4 centuries to observe Inuit survival techniques, igloos, seal oil lamps, flexible hunting strategies, yet adopted almost none. Pride, prejudice, or simply the human tendency to dismiss solutions that don't fit our self-image. Today's climate crisis demands similar reckonings, embracing nuclear power despite ideological opposition, redesigning cities around public transit over car culture, rethinking diets to reduce emissions. The Norse had excuses: no satellites to show them the big picture, no scientific consensus on climate shifts, we have none, their ruins whisper a final warning, collapse is rarely sudden. It's the accumulation of small choices, to ignore warning signs, to prioritize tradition over survival, to assume someone else will fix it. The last Greenland Viking didn't starve because the world ended, they starved because they ran out of workarounds for a broken system. As our own glaciers retreat and supply chains strain, their story feels less like history and more like a mirror, one reflecting back the consequences of ignoring the most uncomfortable truth of all: adaptation isn't betrayal. It's the only way forward. So where does that leave us? After centuries of research, excavations, and ice core analysis, the disappearance of Greenland's Vikings remains one of history's most tantalizing puzzles. The leading theories each paint a different portrait of their final days, some bleak, others tinged with grim hope. Climate change stands as the most undeniable culprit. The Little Ice Age didn't just make life harder, it rewrote the rules of survival, turning their European farming traditions into a death sentence. Soil samples and skeletal evidence scream the same truth: they starved in slow motion, watching their cattle wither and their children's bellies swell with hunger, all while the Inuit thrived just beyond their stubborn pride. But was it really that simple? Some archaeologists point to scattered clues of violence: burned longhouses, hastily buried bodies hinting at skirmishes with the Inuit, or even internal strife as resources vanished. Others argue the real killer was economic collapse. When the ivory trade dried up, so did their lifeline to Europe, leaving them stranded without iron for tools or timber for boats. Imagine the desperation of watching the horizon year after year, praying for a sail that never appeared. And then there's the quietest theory of all, that the last survivors didn't die out, but simply walked away. A few may have attempted a desperate exodus by sea, their bones now resting somewhere on the ocean floor. Others might have drifted into the wilderness, their stories lost to the wind. What makes this mystery endure isn't just the lack of answers, it's the haunting familiarity of its themes, a people clinging to tradition as the world changes around them. A society severed from its lifelines, a warning etched in ice about the cost of inflexibility. The Greenland Vikings didn't vanish in a single dramatic cataclysm, they unraveled stitch by stitch, leaving behind ghostly traces of lives interrupted. A half-carved tusk, a child's mitten, a church bell buried face down in the dirt. So what do you think happened? Did the last Viking in Greenland close their eyes in an empty longhouse, or did they set out one final time into the blinding white, chasing a rumor of greener shores? The truth is out there, frozen in the permafrost, hidden in the Inuit oral traditions, or lost to time entirely, and that's the allure of this mystery. It's not just a historical whodunit, it's a mirror. How would we fare, faced with the same impossible choices? Adaptation or extinction isn't just a Viking dilemma, it's the ultimate human trial. The silence of Greenland's fjords might just be history's most eloquent